You wake before dawn. Not from sleep, but from a sound. A slow, deliberate drag of metal against stone. Steel being sharpened in the dark. It's close. Just outside your chamber. You don't move. You don't breathe. You listen. The blade sings with each stroke. As if it knows what it's meant to do. And it is patient. The cold is already inside your bones. Not the kind that can be banished by fire. But the kind that comes when you know. Your body will be empty by nightfall. You sit up in the dark. The walls of the tower rise around you. Heavy with damp, thick with silence. This room once held your coronation robes. Now it holds your last breath. Your hands tremble in your lap. You try to still them. You fail. The linen of your nightgown clings to your skin. Soaked with a sweat that feels like fear. But is older, deeper, more resigned. You hear voices, soft, brittle, whispering. Your ladies are awake. They move like ghosts, careful not to startle you. But you are already beyond fear. What can startle the condemned? What can break what's already been broken? They dress you. Their hands are gentle. Too gentle. You can feel the apology in their touch. They choose gray silk for mourning. And white linen beneath for innocence. Both lies. Both carefully chosen. Because this, too, has been orchestrated. Even your death must be composed. You look down at your hands. The same hands that once signed royal proclamations. Now stripped of rings. Bare, useless, waiting. Outside your window, you hear hammers. The scaffold is being built. Each strike echoes through the stone. Like a bell tolling for a funeral not yet begun. Not a funeral for a woman. But for a name. A reputation. A memory. The air is thick with smells you once ignored. Ash. Sweat. Iron. There is incense burning in the chapel down the hall. A final prayer for your soul. Murmured by men who helped condemn it. You wonder if the executioner has arrived. He came from Calais. He carries a sword, not an axe. They call it a mercy. But you know better. Mercy would have let you live. You rise to your feet. Your legs are unsteady. Not from fear. But from remembering. You remember the path you took to this place. The golden days. The triumphal parade. The crown pressed to your hair. The child you bore. The child you lost. The bed you shared with a king. The silence that followed. Now, in the dark. There is no crown. No husband. No future. There is only steel. And silence. And straw waiting to soak the blood from your neck. They will not bury you with honor. They will not mark your grave. They will not speak your name again. That is the punishment. Not death. But erasure. You walk to the window. The fog is lifting. You can see the scaffold now. It waits, clean and empty. You will be the first woman. And the last queen. To die upon it. You were not born to be forgotten. But now, they will try. If there is anyone left to remember. It will not be the men who sentenced you. Not the priests who prayed over your guilt. Not the king who cast you aside. It will be the ones who still weep in silence. The ones who ask what really happened. And why no one stopped it. If you are remembered. It will be because your ghost refused to rest. Because truth does not die with the body. It lingers. It haunts. It waits. And today. You begin your haunting. If you're watching this and feel even a flicker of sorrow for what and endured. Pause and subscribe to Cursed Chronicles. And if you won't. Tell us why. Genuinely. We want to hear your reasons. The hours before your death are quiet. Not with peace, but with preparation. The sun has not yet risen. But your room has already begun to fill with the ritual of finality. Your ladies do not speak. They move around you like shades, dressing a body that has already begun to leave this world. You have not eaten. You refused the bread. You refused the wine. What nourishment could matter now, when your flesh is no longer yours to keep? Instead, you prayed. Not aloud. Not in any grand, desperate declaration. But inwardly. Fiercely. You whispered names. Elizabeth. Your mother. God. There is no priest here to absolve you. Only stone. And time. And a stillness that coats the walls like frost. The room smells of wool and wax. The same chamber where you once dressed for your coronation. Now, the same room prepares you for execution. You sit as they prepare your hair. It is still dark, still thick, still the color Henry once praised. Raven, he called it. Exotic. Now it is being tied back, covered with a plain white coif. Not for modesty, but to clear your neck. To give the blade a clean line. Your gown is chosen. A soft gray, almost silver in the morning haze. It was the color of your wedding veil. It is now the color of mourning. Your chemise beneath is white. Not the white of innocence, but the white of sacrifice. A blank canvas prepared to be stained. Your hands tremble only once. When you ask to see your daughter. You ask it softly. You know the answer before it's given. But still, the question slips through your lips. Because hope, like breath, is difficult to silence. They deny you. Elizabeth is kept away. Not to protect her, but to protect the story they've written about you. A mother condemned is too complicated a stain for a crown to wear. You sit by the window. You watch them finish the scaffold. Its boards are raw, still pale where the nails bite through. You see the men dragging straw sacks to the platform. The straw is not for comfort. It is to catch what will fall. To soak what your body can no longer hold. They have imported a man for the task. From Calais. Not because he is foreign. But because he is efficient. He is not English. He does not know your name. He carries no hatred. No fear. Only his blade. It is long. Slim. Uncompromising. A sword, not an axe. A cleaner death, they say. Quicker. Silent. But this choice is not about mercy. It is about image. They will speak of your dignity. They will speak of a queen who died without struggle. Not for your sake. But for Henry's. Everything now. From the color of your sleeves. To the slope of your shoulders. To the hour you are called. Has been curated for the illusion of grace. You are not being executed. You are being removed. Sanitized. Made into a lesson. You whisper one last prayer. Not to be saved. You are beyond that. But that the blade will be true. That the man from Calais will not miss. That your knees will hold. That your voice will not crack when you speak your final words. You do not want them to hear you as broken. You want them to remember the silence. It has been said. That queens die with pageantry. With gold. With dirges and banners. But you know the truth. They die in small rooms. With tied hair. And unfinished letters. And no children to say goodbye to. You close your eyes. And breathe. Because the knock is coming. And when it does. When Sir Kingston opens the door. And the world falls into motion. You will rise. You will walk. And you will not beg. Because you were made queen by force. And now they will watch you die with will. If you're still here, if your throat is tight, if your stomach is heavy. Then you felt even a fraction of what she carried in silence. Subscribe to Cursed Chronicles. Because stories like these do not survive on their own. And if you choose not to, at least explain why in the comments. Tell us how a queen's last breath didn't reach you. It began with blood. Not on the scaffold. But in the chambers of Whitehall Palace. A quiet horror. Silk sheet stained with the end of a lineage. January, 1536. The snow had not yet melted. The fires in the hearths gave no comfort. Because the queen, the woman you are now watching walk toward execution, was losing the one thing that could have saved her. A son. He was not yet born. But his weight was heavy in her womb. And heavier in the expectations of the court. He was England's hope. The insurance of a dynasty. And he died. The blood began in the early hours. And collapsed. The pain was immediate and final. She did not scream. There were no cries in the hall. Only the quiet horror of wet cloth and wasted prayers. The boy was still. Perfectly formed, they said. With fingers. With eyelids. With no breath. It was her third loss. But this one was different. This one had a name before he was born, Edward. Whispered in shadows. Hoped for in secret. At the very same hour. Somewhere across the palace. Henry mounted a horse. It was a tournament. He had insisted on it. The king, in his glory, proving to his court and God alike that his strength had not faded. Not with age. Not with disappointment. Not with Anne. But the horse reared. The king fell. The weight of his armor drove him into the earth. He did not rise. For 2 hours, he did not wake. There was panic in the corridors. His physicians rushed to him. Some claimed he was dead. Some hoped he was. The queen heard of it immediately. As she bled through her gown. They told her the king had fallen. She gasped. Stood. Collapsed. And in that collapse, she lost her son. 1 hour. 1 fall. 2 lives shattered. That morning, the crown tumbled without ceremony. Not from Henry's head. But from Anne's future. She had staked everything on the child inside her. Every favor. Every enemy silenced. Every tongue at court that had cursed her rise. That unborn boy was her redemption. He was meant to silence the ghosts of Catherine and Mary. To prove that she had not destroyed a marriage and a church for nothing. Now, he lay wrapped in linen. Not in gold. Not in the cradle Henry had ordered. But in silence. And Henry, when he awoke, was not the man she had known. His face was different. His mood darker. A pressure had taken hold behind his eyes. And it never left. The doctor spoke in guarded tones. The blow to the head may have changed something. Permanently. He was more violent now. More withdrawn. His legs never fully recovered. His tempers became storms. And he turned from Anne. Not all at once. But like frost taking root on a window. It began at the edges. Small, dismissive cruelties. Then came the distance. Then came the whispers. Then came Jane Seymour. And never truly recovered. Not from the loss. Not from the silence that followed. She had miscarried a son. Henry had nearly died. And something between them, something once terrifyingly powerful, was extinguished in a single, brutal day. From that moment. And was no longer a wife. No longer a mother. No longer a queen in Henry's eyes. She was simply a mistake to be undone. She miscarried a son the day Henry nearly died. If that fact doesn't change the way you see this story, maybe you're already too far gone. Subscribe if your heart still works. And if not, go ahead, confess it in the comments. We're listening. It does not begin with truth. It begins with necessity. Henry could not simply discard a queen. Not this one. Not the woman he had torn a kingdom apart to marry. He needed a reason. And if no reason existed, one would be built. Crafted with care. Layered with whispers. And nailed together like a scaffold. Thomas Cromwell was the builder. He had once been Anne's ally. They had risen together. Fueled by reform, ambition, strategy. But ambition has no loyalty. And in Cromwell's mind, the Queen had become a liability. Henry's disappointment was heavy. Jane Seymour's presence was growing. Anne's enemies were sharpening knives. And Cromwell saw which way the wind was turning. So he turned with it. He understood what Henry could not say aloud. The king wanted and gone. Quietly. Completely. Without protest. Without blame. But he could not simply annul her. That had been done once. And to do it again would admit mistake. It would call into question Elizabeth's legitimacy. It would call into question Henry himself. No. And could not be undone. She had to be condemned. So Cromwell began to write a different kind of record. He needed men. Names. Proximity. He began with the easiest prey. Mark Smeaton. A court musician. Low-born. Talented. Vulnerable. He was not protected by noble blood. He had no allies. Only the favor of those who enjoyed his music. On April 30th, 1536. Smeaton was taken. Not to the Tower. But to Cromwell's own home in Stepney. There, behind locked doors. He was questioned. Pressed. Broken. We do not have the details. The records are clean. Sanitized. But the man who walked in denying everything emerged confessing adultery with the Queen. Not once. But multiple times. He gave dates. Times. Rooms. Confessions that would become the foundation of a case. Not built on fact. But on compliance. And once Cromwell had the first stone, he began to build fast. The next was Henry Norris. One of Henry's oldest friends. Trusted. Loyal. Intimate with the king's private life. He was arrested on May 1st. During a May Day celebration. Flowers still clung to the courtyard arches. When the guards dragged him away. A celebration of rebirth. Turned into a funeral march. He denied everything. But denial meant nothing now. The net had already been cast. William Brereton came next. A man of the Privy Chamber. Welsh. Ambitious. Unremarkable, until now. Cromwell added to Brereton's supposed sins. Not just adultery. But conspiracy to murder the king. It was a necessary escalation. If Anne's lovers were only adulterers, their crimes were hers alone. But if they were plotting Henry's death, then Anne was not just unfaithful. She was treasonous. Francis Weston followed. Young. Married. Barely 25. He had nothing to gain. Everything to lose. But his charm. His closeness to the Queen. Made him useful. Rumors had always followed Anne. That she laughed too freely. That she flirted too easily. That she was dangerous when pleased. Now those rumors would become rope. But Cromwell's most calculated move was George Boleyn, Anne's brother, her closest confidant, the man who had shared her triumph, and now would share her ruin. On May 2nd, George was arrested. The charge, incest. It was not just grotesque. It was strategic. Because incest rewrote Anne's story. From seductress to monster. No one would defend her now. No one would dare. Cromwell's genius was not in what he found. It was in what he manufactured. The court records were altered. Dates were carefully chosen. Even when they made no sense. One charge claimed Anne had slept with Norris. On a day she was known to be at Greenwich, miles away from him. Another claimed she had seduced Smeaton. On a night she was recovering from childbirth. But accuracy no longer mattered. Only appearance. Only the illusion of a pattern. The Crown did not need proof. It only needed narrative. And Cromwell gave it one. Built from tortured words. Carefully timed arrests. And a queen who had become politically inconvenient. Truth had no place here. Only silence. Only submission. Only spectacle. And the engine of conspiracy, now fully awake, would not stop. Until it had crushed every name that had once stood beside Anne. If you can still call this justice, then history is wasted on you. But if you see this for what it was, a masterpiece of destruction forged in royal silence, then subscribe to Cursed Chronicles. Because if you don't, tell us why. Truly. What stopped you from standing beside the truth? The Queen was laughing. That was the last sound the court remembered. Laughter. Ringing out from the gallery. Wherein Boleyn had just watched a match of tennis. The ball had struck the far wall. The players bowed. The sun spilled through the high windows. And in that brief moment, she forgot the danger pressing in around her. But the game was already over. She just didn't know it. A messenger arrived. His face was too calm. His tone too measured. And when he bowed, it was not out of respect, but pity. The Queen was summoned. And did not return to her chambers. She did not speak to her ladies. She did not eat. Instead, she was taken. Escorted away from the sunlight. Down long, cold corridors. Into silence. No charges were read. No explanations offered. She was not permitted to prepare. No one told her that her brother had already been seized. That her name had already been carved into indictments. That the court had already decided how her story would end. She was delivered to the Tower. Not to the dungeon. But to the very apartments she had once occupied. As a crowned queen. The same walls that had echoed with music and celebration were now her prison. The same windows where she had once waved to crowds now showed her only shadows. It was deliberate. Let her sit among the ghosts of her own rise. Let her taste what she had once held. So the fall would be complete. Sir William Kingston, the constable of the Tower, was assigned to observe her. Not to comfort. Not to protect. But to record. Every word. Every gesture. Every tear or absence of one. His reports still exist. They show a woman oscillating between composure and collapse. Moments of strange calm. Followed by uncontrollable weeping. She asked questions no one would answer. Where was her brother? Why had the king not come? What had she done? There were no answers. Only silence. And the sound of the Tower gates locking shut behind her. On May 15th. Anne was brought to trial. Not in Westminster. But in the Tower itself. It was another choice made with care. No public gallery. No supporters. No eyes to question what they were about to witness. The charges were read in full. Adultery. Conspiracy to murder the king. Incest. She stood before a court of men who owed their fortunes to the crown. 26 peers. Many of them her enemies. Some of them former allies. At their head sat Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, her uncle. His voice did not falter as he recited the accusations that would end his niece's life. He did not look at her, and had no counsel. No right to cross-examine her accusers. No opportunity to call witnesses in her defense. And yet, she did not weep. She denied every charge. With a clarity and poise that unsettled even her enemies. Her voice steady. Her words sharp. The court had expected a broken woman. They received a queen. But truth had no role here. Only structure. Only theater. The prosecution leaned on the testimonies of servants, courtiers, and ghosts. One of the most damning pieces of evidence came from a woman who was already dead. Lady Bridget Wingfield. Once a trusted member of Anne's household. A friend. A companion. She had died months before the trial. But according to the prosecution, she had confided to others that she knew of the Queen's immoral behavior. The details were vague. The quotes second-hand. No documents. No letters. No living mouth to confirm or deny. Just the weight of a dead woman's name, laid like a stone on Anne's chest. The jury leaned in. The courtroom held its breath. Because when the living fail to condemn you, the dead can still be summoned to testify. Imagine knowing your fate was sealed. Because a dead woman allegedly whispered about you. If you don't feel the weight of that, maybe you're not meant to be here. But if you do, subscribe to Cursed Chronicles. And if you don't, write in shame below. Because the silence of the living can be just as damning as the voices of the dead. The trial lasted hours. The verdict came in minutes. Guilty. Of all. Of everything. Of more than could be believed. And less than could be proven. And stood motionless. As the sentence was read. She was to die by beheading. At the king's pleasure. A mercy, they said. To spare her the flames. She bowed. She said nothing. Because what can a queen say when her crown has been melted down into a weapon meant to silence her forever? They were 5 men of different stations, different temperaments, different allegiances, but united in one thing. They died so the queen could be destroyed more completely. Their names, once spoken in courtly greetings, in chambers of power, in whispered alliances, now vanish beneath silence. Because when a woman is erased, those who stood too close to her must vanish too. The first was the easiest to break. Mark Smeaton. Court musician. Commoner. Gifted with the lute. And cursed with proximity. He had played for Anne. That was enough. He had smiled. That was enough. Torture extracted from him what the crown required. A confession. Detailed, but impossible. He named dates when the queen was not even present. He claimed liaisons in palaces she never entered. But truth was not the point. The point was that he confessed. So others could follow. When they took him to the scaffold, he did not plead. He did not recant. He had already died in Stepney. In the dark hours of that questioning, They say he whispered prayers. They say his eyes were hollow. They say the sword was merciful. Then there was Henry Norris, groom of the stool. A man trusted with the king's most intimate moments. He had been with Henry longer than Anne had. He denied everything. Even under pressure. Even with the noose tightening. He refused to lie. Some say he believed the king would pardon him. Others say he knew no pardon would come. And simply refused to purchase his life with a lie. When he mounted the scaffold, he declared his innocence. With dignity. With composure. The crowd that gathered to watch was not permitted to grow too large. Cromwell had arranged for discretion. The more silent the deaths, the cleaner the history. William Brereton stood next. A man of the king's privy chamber. Welsh, ambitious. Loyal to his family. He had been marked by politics long before Anne's fall. He had enemies. The accusation of adultery was a convenient excuse. To eliminate him, Cromwell had added a twist. Treason. Conspiracy. Murder. Anne was not merely unfaithful. She was deadly. Brereton stood tall at his execution. He denied every charge. He did not ask for mercy. He met the crowd's eyes. Some wept. Some looked away. But no one cheered. Francis Weston was younger. Bright. Arrogant, some said. Recently married. He had laughed with Anne in court. He had danced with her. That was enough. He, too, proclaimed his innocence. He had been dragged into the conspiracy by proximity. By being too handsome. Too favored. Too visible. They say he trembled only once. When the sword was raised. Not out of fear. But because he had not yet finished his prayer. And last. George Boleyn. Anne's brother. Her mirror. Her other half in ambition, in wit, in loyalty. His trial had been crueler than the rest. They accused him not just of betrayal. But of incest. A crime so repulsive. It would ensure silence. Who would defend such a man? Who would question the verdict? He defended himself. Brilliantly. Relentlessly. So well, in fact, that some believed he might be acquitted. Until he made a mistake. When handed a question to read silently. A private question about the king's impotence. He read it aloud. In full. The room froze. The king's failure. Spoken in public. A humiliation too deep to forgive. Whatever hope remained. Died in that moment. On the day of his execution. George spoke not of his crimes. But of his soul. Of his faith. Of his sister. He died cleanly. But not quietly. Because those who watched him die knew they were watching the last of the Boleyn fire. 5 men. Condemned. Executed. Forgotten. Not because they were guilty. But because they were necessary. Their deaths were not about justice. They were about erasure. To remove and cleanly. The roots had to be pulled out with her. Friends. Lovers. Brother. By the time the sword touched her neck. There was no one left standing beside her. Only silence. And straw. If you've made it this far. And still believe these men were guilty. You haven't been listening. But if you feel their names echo now. If you feel how easily 5 lives can be folded into one woman's silence. Then subscribe to Cursed Chronicles. And if you won't. Tell us why. Write their names in the comments. And then explain. Why you chose not to carry them forward. The morning was grey. Not with storm. but with the kind of dimness that hangs over places where death has already settled. She had barely slept. Perhaps not at all. Because time becomes shapeless when you are waiting to be ended. The knock came just past dawn. Sir William Kingston entered. His face carved in protocol. He informed her quietly. "It is time." And rose. Not like a prisoner. But like a woman who had already decided how she would be remembered. Her gown was grey silk, unadorned. Her chemise white beneath it, still spotless. She adjusted the fabric herself. She arranged her sleeves with care. And when her ladies moved to weep, she hushed them. "Peace, it is not now my time to weep." The corridors she walked were familiar. She had passed them in glory once. When she was queen. When the tower had opened to receive her with celebration. Now the same stones heard the echo of her footsteps. The same iron doors opened to release her. To death. The scaffold had been constructed on Tower Green. A short walk from her quarters. Not high like those for traitors. But low. Deliberate. Intimate. Her death was not meant to be a spectacle. But a statement. Crowds had gathered. Though fewer than expected. The execution was meant to be quiet. Efficient. No cries. No disruption. No martyrdom. She ascended the platform with steady steps. The wind stirred her gown. But not her resolve. Her ladies followed. White-faced, shaking. Clutching small cloths already damp with grief. The sword was not visible. It lay hidden in the straw. A foreign blade carried by a man from Calais. Trained. Precise. Silent. He stood still. Dressed in black. Hooded. He did not meet her eyes. He had been told not to. This was not personal. And stepped to the center of the scaffold. The sky above her held no sun. Just the weight of grey clouds. As if the heavens themselves could not bear witness. She turned to address the crowd. Her voice was clear. There was no tremor. "I am come hither to die. As the law hath found me guilty. I die the king's true servant. But God's first." She did not plead. She did not curse. She did not name names. Because in that moment. And Boleyn understood. What legacy meant. That history would remember silence. As strength. She removed her hood. Her hair had been bound tightly. Tucked beneath a linen coif. To ease the blade's path. She knelt. Without help. Without hesitation. She arranged her skirts modestly. Tucked her hands beneath her body. So they would not twitch at the end. Her ladies stepped forward. One blindfolded her. Another wept so hard her knees nearly gave out. And whispered a final prayer. The words are lost to time. But her lips moved. And then, they didn't. The executioner stepped forward. Silently. He did not announce himself. He did not raise the sword in view. He called to a servant behind her. A practiced deception. To shift her posture. She turned her head slightly. Unaware. And in that instant. The blade moved. One stroke. No scream. No flinch. Just the soft thud of silk and skin. Meeting the straw below. The crowd was still. There was no cheer. Only a collective inhale. That no one released. Her ladies caught her body. They wrapped her remains in a white cloth. Her blood soaking through before they even reached the chapel. It was done. And yet. Nothing felt ended. Later, the executioner would remark. How small her neck had been. Slender. Delicate. Like a child's. That detail, small as it was, would haunt the court. Future queens would remember it. Whispers would say that Anne had died too easily, and that her composure had made the blade colder. She went to the scaffold with more grace than the men who sent her there. If you can admire that, but still won't subscribe, at least explain your reasons in the comments. The rest of us will remember her. The sword had fallen. The queen was gone. But death was not enough. Because for Henry, silence was not the end. Erasure was. Within days, her name began to disappear. Not slowly, not subtly, but with the speed of a kingdom desperate to forget. Painters were summoned to royal halls. Not to capture new glory, but to unpaint the past. Portraits of Anne were stripped from frames. Destroyed. Burned. Turned to ash in palace furnaces. Brushstrokes that once immortalized her beauty, now smeared into oblivion. In the royal palaces. Above doorways, along gallery walls. The letter A had been carved beside the king's own H. A declaration of union. Of conquest. Of a queen who had once been untouchable. Now the stonemasons were called. Chisels in hand. Instructions clear. Strike her from the walls. Dig out the curves of her initial. Make it look as though she had never existed. Some of the A's were gouged out so violently that the surrounding stone cracked. Other letters were clumsily recarved. An A reshaped into an I or a J. Marks that didn't quite match, but would suffice in the story being rewritten. In Hampton Court, the Grand Palace and helped design. Her coat of arms was replaced. Not taken down, but scraped. Filed. Painted over. The falcon she chose, white, crowned, proud, was banished. In its place, Jane Seymour's badge. A phoenix. A rebirth. A new queen, from new ashes. Even the tapestry records were edited. Official logs altered. Dates reworked. Mentions of and crossed out. Or replaced with vagueness. The former queen. The late consort. She who once held favor. At court, her name became a danger. A thing whispered only behind closed doors. With candles low and voices lower. To speak of Anne Boleyn was to question the king's judgment. To remember her was to challenge the story now told. Because the new truth, the one Henry demanded, required that she never truly existed. Not as a queen. Not as a wife. Not as a mother of a future monarch. But the stones didn't always obey. Some carvings remained. Subtle. Faint. Buried beneath layers of dust and ivy. In the Chapel Royal at Hampton Court. On an arch above the choir. The letters HA* survive. Intertwined in a lover's knot. The masons missed it. Or perhaps, refused. Elsewhere, above a fireplace deep in the palace. A falcon still perches on a scepter. Its wings outstretched. Its crown cracked but unbroken. A symbol left behind. Half shattered. Half defiant. Because history can be buried. But stone remembers. Anne's memory was not merely edited. It was gaslit. A campaign not just of destruction, but of distortion. They called her a seductress. A traitor. A curse. They taught Elizabeth to forget her. They rewrote sermons. They issued proclamations. They raised Jane up on Anne's grave. But in the quiet places. In corners of palaces. In faded manuscripts. In the hands of women who remembered what silence felt like. And endured. Not because Henry allowed it. but because erasure leaves scars. And the deeper the wound, the more certain it is to be uncovered. Her portraits may have burned. Her banners may have fallen. But the truth, the one they tried to bury, grew in the cracks. If you can feel how deliberate this was, how carefully her memory was broken piece by piece, then you understand the cruelty of forgetting. Subscribe to Cursed Chronicles, so that those who were meant to vanish are remembered with full voice, full story, full name. And if you won't, tell us why. Explain in the comments why you chose silence. In the face of stolen memory, she was not there to see it. She never heard the bells ring, never saw the crowds gather in the streets, never watched the crimson banners flutter over Whitehall, or the velvet canopy unfurl above the throne. But it happened. In the end, it happened. The daughter they called a bastard rose from silence, from shadow, from the ashes of a forgotten mother, and became England's sovereign, Elizabeth. When and died, her child was not yet 3 years old, too young to understand the word treason, too young to know that her mother's name would be erased from the lips of every courtier, every servant, every priest sworn to the new lie. She was stripped of her title. No longer princess. Now simply Lady Elizabeth. Her place in the line of succession vanished like her mother's portraits. She was moved from court, placed in distant households, raised not with affection, but tolerated, the daughter of a dead traitor, and a king already hunting his next queen. But she remembered. Even as a child, Elizabeth understood what it meant to watch, to wait, to learn in silence. She read. She wrote. She studied the language of power. Before she ever claimed it, her tutors noted her sharpness. Not just intelligence, but calculation, control. A steel spine wrapped in velvet. As her siblings fell, Edward to illness, Mary to paranoia, Elizabeth remained unmarried, unbending, unbroken. And in 1558, she was crowned Queen of England. The people roared her name. The same people who had once lined the banks of the Thames to watch her mother's barge drift toward the Tower. The same city that had turned its back now lifted her onto its shoulders. She did not speak of and often. Not in court. Not in letters. But absence is not the same as denial. Because beneath her gown, Elizabeth wore a ring. Gold, enameled. Set with a single, hidden hinge. Inside, 2 portraits. One of herself. And one of Anne Boleyn. It was not an heirloom. It was a declaration. Silent, personal, irreversible. She never removed it. When she died, the ring was taken from her hand. It remains one of the few physical proofs that Anne was not completely erased. Elizabeth did not rewrite the past. She did not rehabilitate her mother's name in law. She didn't have to. She became the proof. And had been killed for ambition, for passion, for refusing to be obedient. Her daughter reigned for 44 years. With those same traits sharpened into rule. They said Anne's womb was cursed. That she could not give Henry a son. And yet the girl they cast aside became the Virgin Queen. A monarch who redefined England. Not by bloodline, but by will. She survived plots, assassins, invasions. She faced kings, popes, nobles, traitors. And buried them all. And through it all, the ghost of Anne Boleyn stood beside her. In the tilt of Elizabeth's chin. In the arch of her brow. In her refusal to bend. In her refusal to marry. In the way she kept her mother's name close. Not in speeches. But in the marrow of her reign. And was meant to vanish. But through Elizabeth. She endured. Not as a cautionary tale. Not as a sinner. Not as a scandal. But as the root. Of one of the most glorious reigns. England had ever known. They tried to bury Anne. But Elizabeth resurrected her. If you believe stories like this should never be forgotten. Subscribe to Cursed Chronicles. If not, we're listening. Tell us in the comments why you won't. And remember, silence is how erasure begins. It did not take long. 11 days. Not even a fortnight had passed. Before the king remarried. The scaffold where Anne's blood had dried. Was barely cleaned. The straw not yet replaced. The smell, iron and incense. Still hung in the corridors of the tower. But Henry was already gone. He did not visit the grave. He did not pray. He did not speak her name. Instead, he rode to Hampton Court. There, in a small, private chapel. He took Jane Seymour as his wife. No fanfare. No grand procession. Only quiet satisfaction. As if the removal of Anne had been. Not an execution. But a correction. Jane was everything and was not. Submissive. Pale. Soft-spoken. A woman who would never challenge him. Never argue. Never demand too much of the crown she wore. And Henry. Once the lover who had waited 7 years to claim Anne. Now seemed almost relieved. To be rid of her. But something shifted. Those who saw him after her death. Spoke of a heaviness in his face. A restlessness. He gained weight. His temper worsened. His legs began to fail. Some whispered that it was the blow to his head. Others said it was a curse. That Anne's execution had stained him in ways no marriage could cleanse. And Thomas Cromwell, the man who had orchestrated it all, watched in silence. For a time, he was rewarded. Elevated. Respected. He continued to reform the realm. To tighten the king's grip on every corner of England. But power beside a tyrant is always temporary. By 1540, Cromwell had arranged another marriage. This time to Anne of Cleves. A diplomatic union. Strategic. Safe. But Henry hated her. Called her ugly. Called Cromwell a fool. The same man who had engineered Anne Boleyn's destruction. Was now accused of treason. And heresy. He was arrested without warning. Stripped of title. Paraded through the streets. And on July 28, 1540. Just 4 years after Anne. Cromwell was beheaded. The blade had come full circle. But Anne. Anne never left. Not entirely. The tower never forgets. Its walls are too thick. Its stones too old. They hold memory like breath. For centuries. Guards have reported her presence. Not in madness. Not in superstition. But in records. Cold, official. Matter-of-fact entries in tower logs. Unusual chill in Queen's house. Sighted woman in grey ascending scaffold steps. Candle extinguished. No draft present. Soft footsteps at 2 a.m. No one assigned patrol. And is said to appear near the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. Where her body was buried. In an old elm chest. Meant for archery bows. No stone. No inscription. Just soil. They say she walks near Tower Green. head bowed. Sometimes carrying roses. Sometimes. Her head. More than one sentry has resigned. More than one servant has refused to clean the Queen's house after sunset. One account, dated 1864, details a soldier who fainted after witnessing a figure in white kneeling at the spot where the scaffold once stood. When approached, the figure turned. The soldier said she had no eyes, only a face frozen in something between sorrow and knowing, whether ghost or memory, and remains. Not for revenge, not for pity, but because history, when buried too deep, rises in different forms. Some truths refuse to stay dead. If you felt her presence in this story, if you've heard her steps echo just behind each word, then subscribe to Cursed Chronicles. Let the record show. She was not forgotten. Not entirely. And if you choose silence, explain why in the comments. Because this time, she deserves to be heard. The sound of steel. That's where it began. A blade being sharpened before dawn. Slow, deliberate, without pity. It cut the air long before it touched her neck. And long after the stroke. It never truly stopped ringing. Because some blades never leave their target. They pass through flesh, but stay buried in memory. The sword was fast. Faster than pain. Faster than prayer. But the silence it left behind was infinite. It stretched through stone corridors. Through royal decrees. Through centuries of forgetting. It settled in the walls of the tower. In the soot of chapel stones. In the echoing footsteps of guards, who still whisper of her after midnight. And Boleyn died in a gown the color of ash, beneath a sky that refused to weep. Her name was struck from scrolls. Her portraits turned to dust. Her legacy, buried beneath, lies written in gold ink. But history has its own conscience. And no matter how many letters are carved away from palace walls, some refuse to fade. They tried to tell her story as a warning. A lesson about ambition, about disobedience. About women who rise too far. Too fast. Too loud. But Anne's story was never a warning. It was a reckoning. Because what they feared in her, what they could not control, wasn't her temper. Or her tongue. Or even her bloodline. It was that she endured. They thought they had ended her at Tower Green. But every time her daughter ruled. And rose again. Every time a woman spoke without permission. And stood beside her. Every time history was rewritten. Her ghost stirred. The same eyes that once looked into Henry's. Now watch every throne he left behind. Not with vengeance. Not with hate. But with something colder. Truth. She no longer needs to scream. She doesn't need a monument. She doesn't need to be loved. She just needs to be remembered. Not as a sinner. Not as a saint. But as a woman who stood too close to a crown. And refused to bow. The sound of steel may have announced her final hour. But the silence that followed still lingers. And it demands that someone, somewhere, still listen. If you heard it, if you felt it, then carry it forward. Subscribe to Cursed Chronicles. Because silence is how erasure begins. But remembrance, that's how justice survives.